Well, Mr. President and Stan and my colleagues, let me also start by saying that one of the great inspirations of my life has been President Perez. I'm very happy to be able to count him as a friend, but I count him at least as much as an inspiration. And I want to express my personal gratitude to you, Shimon, for what you are. Let me start by saying that it's very difficult to follow these gentlemen who have spoken, but they have left to me 5/6 of the world to deal with. They're with an exception of 500 million people who are in Latin America, which my friend Alexandro Toledo has mentioned. But let me quickly cover the framework of the discussions for the rest of the world. There are close to 7 billion people on our planet today, and about 1,100,000,000 of them are in the countries that have been described by my former speakers, or if you add Latin America, 1,600,000,000. And if I could, for the purpose of my speech, just include Latin America in the developing world generally, let me say that the developing world has today roughly 6 billion people, and there are 1,000,000,001 in the so-called rich world. Until close to the year 2000, for some 30 years, the rich countries, the OECD countries, had 80% of the global income, and the G7 had 65% of the global income. And that was true for about 3 decades, varying 3% up or down during that period. So we got used to the so-called rich world, which was even richer before the 30 years in relative terms to the poorer countries. In more or less the couple of years before the year 2000, things started to change. And we started to witness a movement where the participation of the G7 and the participation of the rich world started to be reduced. Indeed, the G7, which had been 65% in the following decade of global income, reduced to something less than 57%. And we've seen that starting to continue. And what I want to put out to you and point out to you is that as we move forward, the general projections are that by 2050, we're going to face a different world. Listening to Larry, I'm not sure that these predictions he will agree with, but let me give you those that those that believe slightly less in the future of the United States think might happen. And what they think will happen is that we will have a continuation of what has been happening recently with the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the movement that we see in those countries. We're now the second largest country in the world is China, ahead of Japan and after the United States. This is a tremendous change because after World War II, China and India together were less than 2% of the global GDP. This was the time when I guess the United States, not I guess, I know the United States was dominant in the Reconstruction when the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were formed. And this was a time of the feeling of the rich against the developing countries. It was a time when I was leaving high school and university in the early 50s. And for me, when I was in Australia, the idea was that I could go to these countries because they needed some help. And you felt, even as an Australian, that this was a world full of a lot of people, but very poor, and it was part of your contribution to try and do something for them. How that has changed today, with China now the number 2 power in the world economically, and with the projections that by 2050, China and India will be close to 50% of global GDP. Listening to Larry, I would guess he would put a reduced figure on that number, but let's say it's 40% of the GDP in light of what Larry is saying. And that Asia will be 60% or even 50% of global GDP against what it is today. This is turning the world on its head in terms of the world that I grew up in terms of our perception of the world, in terms of the way it's looked since World War II. A swing to Asia that we last had in 1500 and in 1815, when China and India in those years was 50% of the global GDP. So it's happened before, and the issue of what happens again is likely to be to follow those times. With a swing to Asia that is already emerging, and which Jacob talked about when he talked about the way in which trade is already changing in terms of China, in terms of its influence on the world, and with a delay, it's likely that India will do the same. These countries are not standing back in terms of preparing themselves for this, and I just give you a couple of statistics which I regard as not unimportant. If you start with the financial reserves of the world, 70% of these reserves are now owned by the developing countries. The largest share is in the People's Republic of China, with close to $3 trillion of reserves. Then comes Japan, but then comes, as I read, Russia, Saudi Arabia, the Republic of China, which is Taiwan, Brazil, India, Republic of Korea, Switzerland then comes in, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, and you get number 13, you've got France and Italy. But then comes Algeria, Mexico. Then comes the UK, then Malaysia, Brunei, Poland, Iran, Indonesia, Turkey, Denmark. This is the ranking of these countries in terms of GDP, in terms of foreign exchange reserves, not in terms of GDP. But in terms of GDP, the growth is very substantial. The other thing that we need to observe is that in terms of the way these countries are preparing themselves, we now have foreign students studying in the United States, more than 700,000, of whom China's 127,000 students, and India is 104,000 students. The United States has 13,000 students in China and 2,800 in India. Of the students studying in the United States from these countries, 35% of them are doing engineering, nearly 60% either engineering or science or the related subjects. In our country, 5% are studying engineering. This is a snapshot of maybe unrelated points, but you need to understand when you're now traveling in these countries and when you talk to the leaders of these countries, that they're not standing back and waiting for us. They are reaching out in a way to develop the leaders of tomorrow. And so the main point I would be making is that there is this enormous shift to Asia, but there are two other things that I want to comment on. If you look at Africa, with its currently 53 countries, it will be a continent which until now has had between 1% and 2% of the global GDP. Maybe it'll grow to 4 or 5% by 2050. But it will then have 1.8 billion to 2 billion people, nearly 20% of the then world's population. But the average per capita income is likely to be between $4,000 and $5,000 per capita, at a time when China and India, on the estimates that I've seen, will be of the order of 30,000 to 40,000, and the United States and rich countries will be over 90,000. This is not, in my judgment, a stable situation. This is not an uninformed Africa. This is not an Africa that is unrelated to the rest of the world. They have cellular phones, they have information, they've got technology, they even have aircraft, and as you well know, if you go to Europe, you'll see that they have the possibility of immigration. So you have a somewhat unbalanced world in relation to Africa, and I could talk more about it if it comes up in question. And the final thing I want to say is that in the Middle East, you have a very different situation. You have 350 million people here. You have roughly 105 million between the ages of 15 and 26. And you have 130 million under the age of 15. 10 million a year entering the age of the workforce. 5 million of them are looking for jobs. 3.5 million of them are getting jobs. It's not surprising when you saw the uprisings that we've seen in the Middle East, that firstly, they're connected now in terms of communications. Secondly, if you looked in the streets, they're young people, principally. So what we're seeing now is a revolution in terms of young people in our planet, particularly in the Middle East, but also emerging in the developing countries. My suggestion to you is that you should get your kids ready to learn Mandarin, to start thinking about this other world, which is a different world than we grew up in. It's not a world where 80% of the global income will be owned by the rich countries. It's a time of transition in which we see the rich countries going to 35 to 45% of global GDP, and in which the world of our children is going to be a very different one, with a predominant interest in Asia, with some problems in Africa, and you know better than I what might happen in the Middle East. Thank you very much.